Hello, I'm Steve Feldman. Ulysses, the wanderer, the most human, the most complete of all heroes, husband, father, son, lover, farmer, soldier, pacifist, politician, inventor, and adventurer. It is a theme so overwhelming that I am almost afraid to treat it. And yet I, with my Dublin Odyssey, will double that immortality. Yes, by God, there's a corpse that will dance for some time yet. So says James Joyce, or rather the version of James Joyce imagined by Tom Stoppard in his play Travesties. Of course, the Dublin Odyssey he was talking about is the 1922 novel Ulysses, and that's what we'll be talking about for the next hour or so. Welcome to Tales of Braving Ulysses, a podcast on the Liquid Arts Podcast Network.
And you touch the distant beaches with tales of brave Ulysses, how his naked ears were tortured by the sirens sweetly singing, for the sparkling waves are calling you to kiss their white lace lips.
Thank you to Gino Brand providing us with a little cream. Once again, my name is Steve Feldman, joined with Bob Perchan and Frank Beaucher, and I'm speaking to you from Busan, South Korea. A few words about how this podcast came about. Several months ago, the team at Liquid Arts in Busan asked me if I would consider doing a podcast for their podcast network devoted to discussing literature, writing. Well, I sat on that idea for several months until this winter, with some time on my hands, I found myself going back to a novel I tried to read a couple times and put aside, as is wont to happen, as we'll be discussing later. This time I managed to make it to the end of all 932 pages in my edition. Somewhere in the middle, that podcast idea, lying dormant under the winter snow, began to thaw and sprout and blossom. And I thought, what better book to launch a book discussion podcast than James Joyce's Ulysses, that sprawling, complex, confounding, astounding work called by some the greatest English novel of the 20th century. Think of this podcast as maybe a pilot episode, an experiment, much like this book we'll be talking about today. It can be called an experiment. If it goes well, we might continue this experiment with other books, other authors. Let's see how it goes. Who is this podcast for? Well, it's for people, of course, who've read Ulysses, sure. It's also for people who've given it a go and laid it aside, or maybe hurled it aside for the time being. It's for people who maybe have read some Joyce but haven't yet had the gumption to take on Ulysses. It's for people who've simply heard of it. They're aware of this giant, imposing masterwork, this Everest looming on the horizon. They want to learn more about it. Or just anybody who's interested in discussing literature, reading, modernism. As you can see, I'm casting a pretty wide net. I do not want this to be a complex, scholarly deep dive. I just kind of want it to be an informal chat like you might have at a bar with some buddies. Even though we're recording this at 1 p.m., I think it's a little too early to break out the Guinnesses. I'm hoping to demystify this book a little, though perhaps what we might be doing is adding to the mystique by this very project. Above all, I hope it's fun. It's fun for you to listen to, as it will be for us to record. So who is this us I mentioned? With me are two friends I've known for almost as long as the 18 years I've lived in Korea. Two people I've worked with, written with, performed with, gotten arrested with. Two of the sharpest literary minds in town. First, former literature professor at Donga University here in Busan, an outstanding poet, writer of several books of poetry, frequent contributor to Liquid Arts and numerous other artistic endeavors around town, and co-Korean translator with his wife, Mi Kyung, of Jane Austen's Persuasion and currently Sinclair Lewis's Main Street, Mr. Bob Perchan. Welcome, Bob.
Thanks, Steve.
And also with us, my former colleague back in the days of yore, it seems, at Dongi University, outstanding writer of fiction and nonfiction, maker of several cheeky and provocative short films, man always ready to jump into a fray about literature and contribute his 2 cents. And his 2 cents are usually worth much more than that, I'd say, 4 or 5 cents at least. Mr. Frank Beaucher, welcome.
Hi, Steve. Thanks.
So, Ulysses. I recently finished reading this about a month ago, late March, early April, I believe, after 2 abortive attempts decades earlier. I think, like a lot of people, I gave in around page 100, 130, probably, the Proteus episode, maybe the second Bloom episode. Finally made it through this time. For me, it's a book that has, as soon as you become really passionate about literature and books and reading, you tend to read about it, hear about it. Maybe you read one of Joyce's short stories in an anthology, and there's notes about what else he's done, and you hear about Ulysses. Maybe you see a fragment in an anthology, and it's like 3/4 of the page is footnotes, and you're like, wow, what is going on here? Or maybe a teacher mentions it. So it's sort of hovering, like I said, looming, a big wall that you have to deal with, like you might consider Shakespeare. Like every writer, every reader, just you have to deal with it through all the allusions and takeoffs and tributes. So I'd like both of you to talk about your experience reading it, what drew you to it. Why don't we start with you, Bob?
Of course, I had heard about Ulysses. I was an English major in college, and then I went to graduate school, and one of the professors there taught a seminar in Joyce, and particularly in Ulysses. And I had already finished my credit work in grad school, but I decided to audit the course, sit in on it, because I knew it would encourage me to read the book. If other people in the class had read it, why can't I keep up with it? So I don't have a copy of his syllabus. I know at that time we didn't try and do the whole book, I don't think, during the semester. But we had certain, or he had, I should say, he had certain episodes that he thought were the most important. The first 3 episodes introducing Stephen Dedalus, and then episode 4 introducing Leopold Bloom. And then after that, I suppose some of the Nighttown episodes. And then, of course, the final episode, Molly Bloom's monologue, which is a classic in world literature, period, paragraph. Whatever you think about the rest of Ulysses, that monologue is remarkable. And so we were all in awe of that kind of writing. Okay. At the time, I was kind of secretly wanting to be a writer myself, but I was pretending that I was going to be a professor or some crazy dream like that. And the professor was nice enough to identify certain passages that were probably too boring for graduate students who were in a hurry, like episode 17, for example, is not, Stephen and Bloom in the kitchen, if you remember that. Is
Yeah,
that episode 17?
I believe so. The catechism, it's like it's written in the form of a Socratic
Question and
dialogue.
answer, right?
Yeah,
Well, there's the questions and then answers.
right. Yeah.
Bloom liked tea, and then the
Yeah.
answer, what kind of tea
I
did he
kind of
like?
like that one. For me,
Oh,
the
God.
one before that, the Eumaeus episode, where they're at the little restaurant after Nighttown, was
Oh, okay.
where
With the sailor.
I wanted to,
Yeah.
I wanted to rip the book in half because
Okay.
the prose is intentionally bad.
Yeah.
After this slog of Nighttown and the maternity hospital,
Yeah. Okay.
which are two of the most difficult, ambitious, challenging, and just lengthy. And then you get to this prose that's just circumlocuitous and just errors
Yeah.
and clumsy. And he's doing it for a reason. There's a point to everything.
Yeah.
I'm like, after making it through these two previous episodes, can you maybe something like Araby describing Mangan's sister,
Yeah.
hair swinging back and forth?
The
You
soft rope of her hair. Oh, that was not beautiful.
Remember when you used to do that, Jimmy? A little of that, Yeah, so if you're going through it straight through, there are going to be, hacking through the forest with a machete kind of moments. So, Frank, what about you? You also, I understand, had a sort of first experience in an academic setting, right, with a teacher?
That's it. Yeah, similar to Bob's, and I think that was very fortunate. If I had nowhere to start, no bearings, I think I might have been lost at sea kind of thing. I had a course first in Yeats and Joyce, so the two luminaries, I guess, of Irish literature in many ways. And I already loved Yeats. Joyce I knew very little about. I knew that story, Araby, and I loved it also. Mangan's sister, there's a reference to Mangan in, I picked it up. I'd forgotten about it, but there's a reference to Mangan and about his sister too, in Ulysses. So we did that, and then I took a second course only by the same guy on Ulysses, and he was so infectious. His enthusiasm was just irresistible. I mean, he just made it sound so fun, and he was full of those stories. For example, one of the writers that I admire the most is William Faulkner, and he talked about how Faulkner, when he was young and virtually penniless, and he worked, a humdrum job, I think as a nighttime security guard somewhere or something. He was saving up his money to go to Paris and see his literary hero, James Joyce, and he finally made it across the Atlantic, and heard that Joyce was holding court in a restaurant, and walked over there and just saw him through the window and chickened out, turned around. I can't. And never went in, never met the guy. So after saving his money for a couple of years, I thought that was a beautiful story, and he had tons of stories like that. He could tell 3 stories like that in one class. So by the end of it, I was just raring to read the book. And as in Bob's case, we didn't go through, we went through certain parts of the book, excerpts, but we didn't read the whole novel. And I think he did that on purpose to sort of, I want to read this thing.
Now, I know you've reread it often, so do you go back to certain episodes, or do you plow through it beginning to end now, or whatever takes your fancy at the time?
When I read it, I try to read it from beginning to end. I was trying to do like an annual pilgrimage, which is a tradition more honored in the breach than the observance. But
Well, your Hamlet quote is apropos because there's a lot of references, allusions, like direct discussion of Hamlet in this novel. Stephen Dedalus has this whole theory of Shakespeare related to Hamlet. So, it leads to the question: how much foreknowledge do you need to read this novel, because James Joyce, he's trying to encompass only, everything about human history, language, literature, culture, religion, science, physiology. He had this very formal Jesuit education, and was a genius. And he tried to make this a book about everything, while it being about something ultra specific. So, how much do you need to know? Should you go back and reread the Odyssey?
Well, I think you, first of all, before you reread the Odyssey, you ought to read it first. You can reread it later. A lot of people haven't read it.
Right.
Okay, and definitely you have to sit down and read a summary of what the Odyssey is all about, or some condensed version. Pick up your old classic comic book, maybe, of the Odyssey or whatever. But
yeah, I had a middle school version that was, I remember very clearly, and it really stuck in my mind. I had never read the actual Homer epic poem, so, but I'm familiar with, of course, Scylla and Charybdis and the Cyclops and the Sirens. That's something that almost becomes, if you learn anything about Greek mythology, you'll have at least some of those episodes like, oh yeah, I know that.
Right, but the core of the story, right? I think the Homer, the Homer poem is just the story of this guy who's been gone for what is it, 20 years? I think
10 years at the war, then 10 years traveling
10
back.
years coming back, so 20 years. And his son, Telemachus, is sort of, holding the fort, and while his mom, is refusing the suitors and who are eating at Ulysses' table while he's gone. And they all want to marry her, and she says, I'll pick one of you guys when I'm done knitting this thing or making, and she never, at night she rips it up again, so she starts again in the morning. So she's the faithful, long-suffering wife, and Telemachus is the son who's like holding the fort, and that's kind of in many ways turned on its head, because Molly Bloom as Penelope
Not
is
so faithful.
She's not that faithful.
she's not patient, no. She's not patient Penelope.
No. So in many ways, I think the Joyce's book turns Homer's Odyssey on its, it changes a lot of it. Let's put it that way. But it is the story of a wandering hero.
Yeah, so I was thinking there might be a few listeners out there who, well, let's assume there are a few listeners out there, period.
Okay.
Let's assume there are a few listeners out there that maybe don't know much about this novel. You tell them at the bar you're reading Ulysses, and they say, oh, what's that? Biography of Ulysses S. Grant? Well, tell me about that. If you had to describe it in 20 seconds, what would you say?
It's a long book about one day.
Where?
In Dublin, Ireland, June 16th, 1904. And everything happens.
And so it follows this guy named Ulysses going around Dublin?
Well, it's really there are two main characters in this strange book. There's a younger, who I guess is the Telemachus, who's Stephen Dedalus, and the book opens with him, introduces us to him, and then just completely breaks away from him. And for the rest of the book, until the very end, when the Molly Bloom soliloquy, we're treated to that. Then we follow Leopold Bloom, who's the second main character. So it's a day in the life of those two guys, right?
Right. Now, so you have a story set in Dublin, and it parallels or mirrors in many ways, although it subverts them, as you said, in many ways, of Homer's The Odyssey. Now, about 8 years after this book was published in 1922, James Joyce, in a conversation with his friend, made this, it's called the schema, or schematics, like a chart of each episode and which episode it matches with in the Odyssey, in addition to sort of the narrative style of that particular episode, the controlling symbol. Each episode has a bodily function that it focuses on. So a whole chart sort of explaining this, because James Joyce was just shocked that people were reading this and they weren't picking up on that. Well, when Bloom gestures with his cigar, he's clearly, stabbing the Cyclops in the eye. Don't, come on, people. And so he made this schema to sort of help people out. And it's usually included with in a foreword or introduction of any episode or any edition of the novel you care to pick up. Or I'm sure you can find it on the internet. How important is it to understanding each episode that okay, this is Sirens, this is Lestrygonians, this is Circe, this is
Wandering
Proteus,
Rocks,
Wandering Rocks. Is that important?
Well, I think it adds a lot to the, because it gives you bearings. It's hard to read through this book if you have no bearings. Like I said, you're kind of a, storm-tossed cork on the top of the sea. You don't know where you're going. Whereas, with these schemata, it's helpful. The colors, he puts colors in there. Music's important, and there's a lot of stuff. Yeah.
Is it? It's almost ridiculous to talk about spoilers in a book like Ulysses, but could you say you're perhaps depriving yourself of that sort of puzzle-solving pleasure? Like, oh, I get that. That's this is Sirens because it's all about music in this chapter, and they're singing. And does it detract from the experience to know that ahead of time? Because I don't think it does.
Well, I guess if you knew, you could start it with the 19, Homeric chapters, but it doesn't actually match. I think there's 17 in Homer, and there are 19 in Ulysses. So
there's more in
right.
Ulysses,
and they're not in the same order or something
right.
like that, right? So, but knowing what the Odyssey ones are and trying to match them up, I imagine that would be interesting.
In the introduction of my edition, the writer says, look, you don't eat a delicious meal and say, well, I need to know the recipe or I won't really enjoy it. Nobody says that, right? You don't need to know the recipe. But on the other hand, I like to know what I'm eating.
Right.
Right? Like, if you're eating a sort of a big rice mixture, I like to know, is this jambalaya? Or is this chicken biryani, or is this shrimp fried rice, right? So if you have no bearings at all, like you said, you're sort of a tempest tossed.
Yeah.
And
what is this thing?
Yeah.
And to this day, I don't know what UP up is all about. I mean, so somebody gets his knickers in a bunch over this thing, and even Molly at the end, she mentions it in her soliloquy. It's supposed to be a big deal, really offensive that you say UP up. Is it UP like you go to the bathroom standing up? What is it? I have no idea what it is, and I've never been told.
Yeah, you'll quickly find out there are a huge number of things like that, little repeated references that are just remain enigmatic, and there are several theories, but it's all left blurry. It's one of his themes, really, that language has its limits, and you can never really have a set defined meaning of anything. Let's talk about, this is a book we've all read, and, just favorite bits or least favorite bits. I've always talked about my least favorite bit, the Stephen and Leopold at the restaurant. What about your least favorite? Or we can eschew that and just go right to favorite bits. What stands out for you?
Well, for me, my favorite episode, let's just say it, is the last episode, okay, Molly Bloom's monologue. But within the story, say, of Leopold Bloom, the episode that I liked the most was it's the Nausicaa episode, and Leopold Bloom is watching the girls on the beach. Gertie McDowell, Sissy Caffrey, and Evie Boardman. I was just looking at it the other day, so I remembered that stuff. And at any rate, Bloom's very interested in these young women, and especially the Gertie McDowell girl. The other girls are there with their little brothers or something like that. At any rate, because of the fireworks going on down the beach, they leave her, and she's just leaning against a rock on the beach. Bloom is watching her. Okay, what's the word when you
Ogling?
no, ogling is the proper word. What's the
Eavesdropping?
no, you know.
Espying?
When you're looking at a woman and you're not supposed to be
Leering?
all the time.
Leering? Keeping
No.
calming?
It'll come to me. At any rate, Gertie McDowell's sitting there, okay, leaning against a rock. The skyrockets are going up. She leans back a little bit more, and as she leans
hisses up
back,
her
she
skirt.
lifts her leg, okay, and Bloom gets excited as this is happening, and he starts playing with himself with his hand in his pocket and does the whole routine, so to speak, ejaculates and so forth, as the skyrockets are blasting off. And my favorite part is when she gets up, she stands up from the rock, and she starts walking down to the beach, and it's obviously that, as Bloom said, she's lame. My God. Okay. And I love that episode because it undercuts the entire experience that Bloom himself was having. And as I'm going to say something kind of weird here, but do you remember the movie The Hustler?
Paul
Sure.
Newman?
Paul Newman.
Jackie Gleason.
Okay, Jackie Gleason. Do you remember in that movie, Fast Eddie is sitting in the bus station luncheonette area, and he sees a girl, and he's trying to pick her up. He's talking to her. He's flirting with her, but not getting very far. Ultimately, he will have an affair with her, but at this moment, he fails to seduce her, and she stands up and she walks away, and she has a limp. Okay. And
Smart ass Hollywood screenwriter, like.
no, actually,
I read Ulysses.
I checked it, and it's in the novel. Okay, I have a copy of the novel, and I checked it. It's in the novel. It really happens. The novel was written by a guy named Walter Tevis, okay, who taught creative writing at Ohio University, where I was a grad student. I knew him a little bit.
Oh, wow.
Okay, and even though he wrote about stuff like The Hustler, he was deep into James Joyce, and I always wondered if he picked up that limp idea from the Gertie McDowell
Oh,
episode.
he must have.
Okay, I always wondered about that.
In that scene, does she realize that Bloom has masturbated?
No.
I would say she knows he's watching
Yeah.
her
Yeah, she
very,
says.
very
Right, right.
carefully. Okay, she knows he's staring at her.
Now, this might be a good time to mention that Ulysses is a famously banned book. Soon after it came out, 1923, it was declared obscene in the U.S., partly because of that scene. Also, the Molly Bloom final episode is very, very sexually frank.
Nighttown.
Nighttown is full of whores.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah.
It was, I believe, 1930 or 32 where an appeals court, I believe, the judge thought that the idea of reading it like you would read Hustler magazine is like absolutely absurd, and that it's a very frank, honest depiction of human sexuality. And from that point on, it was legal to purchase in the United States.
There's a funny story about the banning of the book. Okay, the book was banned in the U.S. Random House wanted to publish it. Okay, and so they made a deal with Joyce to publish the American edition, but they wanted to get it legal before they actually published it. So they planted a copy on a ship so that the customs would find it.
Yeah. It was all
Okay, the
contrived.
customs people would find it, they would impound it, and then Random House could take them to court and finally decide whether the book should be banned or not, whether it was obscene literature or not. And they won the case, and then they went ahead and published it.
Right.
So, but that's a funny story about they planted the book. They wanted the book to be found, okay, as contraband.
That's another thing about the book that I think puts people off or just intimidates them into not trying it, because they think it's, it's this hyper serious, monumental, unreadable, opaque, opus, where, in fact, it's incredibly funny. There's an awful lot of humor in there, and there's a lot of sex. So if you like sex and humor, that book has it in spades. I mean, there's a lot of that stuff in the book.
So Frank, what's your favorite
I was
episode
gonna
within
say,
an
I was
episode?
going to say Wandering Rocks, but that's the Gertie McDowell, and I was thinking, okay, so Nausicaa. Oh, yeah, okay. Well, but like I said, we talked
So
about
we're talking
before,
about the same episode.
we're talking about the same episode.
Okay.
That's the one I was going to say. And now I'm wondering which one is Wandering Rocks. See,
Wandering Rocks was it was like 32 short films about Dublin, where we get little snapshots of various
right.
places and people. It departs from Leopold.
Actually, I like
Bloom.
that one too. That's when the viceroy passes by, and there's a pipe that vomits up like sewage, as acclamation of the viceroy. So this is political commentary on England being in Ireland, I guess. Yeah, that was good too, but definitely that one, the one you said. The Gertie McDowell one I thought was hilarious and beautifully constructed. The way it builds and builds, and the release at the end.
Yeah.
It's almost like a symphony, with the fireworks and everything. It's great. Yeah.
Yeah, supposedly Bloom ejaculates at the moment that
The rocket.
the
Yeah.
one Roman candle, whatever, goes off. Boom.
Right, yeah.
Okay, and that's actually kind of cheap fiction. If I wrote that, I'd be too embarrassed to, actually submit it for publication. It'd be so obvious. But the way Joyce does it, okay, is just, first of all, it's kind of groundbreaking. Okay, and in fact, one more comment about that episode. That episode was the last one to be published in the Little Review in the United States.
Right, it was serialized.
Was serialized in Little Review, and finally the post office people were tipped off that the Little Review was sending smutty material through the mail. So they were those copies were seized and burned, I think, and no more Ulysses was published serially in the U.S. after that.
Is it the same episode where he has to fart really badly? He waits for the tram to go by, and so it will cover up the sound.
I don't.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Isn't that the end? No, that's the end of an episode.
Right.
That's the very end of an episode, and you get the long,
Brum, 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 brum.
the P, F, and R, and T, and
Right.
it's the sound that a fart would make. But
So
that's the
that's-
very last word of the.
But it's not
But it's not that
Nausicaa.
episode.
That might even be Molly Bloom. She breaks wind.
She does break wind.
She
yeah.
breaks wind in the monologue, and I can't remember.
Book here, but
Actually, Steve, to get back to your question about whether it's a good idea to look at all of the schema before you read the
Yeah.
novel, outside of really knowing the story of the Odyssey, outside of that, I don't think you need any of that on a first reading. Maybe on a third reading or a fourth reading, it might start to bring the novel together artistically, okay, in a new critical sort of sense.
Yes.
Where the text itself is the work of art. And as Joyce said, the artist steps back and pares his fingernails.
Yeah, I think a lot of readers are blown away by the final episode, Molly Bloom's soliloquy. It's what you're left with. The ending of the novel is so beautiful and affirmative to life, and it just leaves you so optimistic after all this verbiage you've waded through. Actually, in my hometown near Amherst, Massachusetts, Amherst College, there's a bathroom in some old classroom building that's the Molly Bloom bathroom. And the text of, I'm not sure if it's the entire text, probably not, but from all the walls and the ceiling are just written with the text from Molly Bloom's soliloquy, and like over in one corner, in one of the bathroom stalls, there's the final words like, "Yes, I will." Yes.
Yes.
I remember making out with a girlfriend in the Molly Bloom
wow.
bathroom. So.
That was a ladies' room? Molly Bloom bathroom? It was a ladies' room?
I don't remember if it was a men's room or a women's room. It must have been a women's room.
Well, that's interesting to know that the Molly Bloom monologue was written.
One of my favorite episodes is, I guess it's identified as the Aeolus,
Oh, the journalists?
the newspaper
Newspaper,
office, and the fact that this ties in with Aeolus episode is itself a great joke, right? In the Odyssey, the god of the winds gives Ulysses the bag so he can control the wind and get home, and it's one of his men, right, who opens the bag and all hell breaks loose and the ship gets blown far, far off course. And the joke is, of course, that all these journalists are full of shit. And they're full of wind. They're
Hot
windy.
air, yeah,
they're full
right.
of hot air, and it's sort of the whole piece sort of mocks the journalistic conventions of that day, and the text is broken up with headlines of just sort of random, inconsequential bullshit, but with typically exaggeratedly dramatic or heroic headlines. I found that chapter very enjoyable. I know, Bob, when I told you I was reading this, you mentioned it's a great novel to listen to a recording of one person or several people, a team of people reading it. And I thought that chapter would be great to listen to. I have not listened to any recorded versions, but I know, Frank, you have. Bob, you've listened.
I have a set of discs, in
Yeah.
fact, CDs, with the entire Ulysses.
Yes, can you
on
talk about like how that aided your enjoyment or understanding of the novel to actually listen to it?
I have an Audible, which is the the spoken book version of Amazon, and so I have a spoken book, an audiobook version, and I've listened to it, just listening to it one time, and it wasn't as good as reading it, but then this last time I listened as I read, and I thought that was pretty awesome. I really enjoyed that. Only problem was I had two different editions. I had the original edition in the spoken version and a later edition, so there were some inconsistencies. But yeah, the voices were great. That particular chapter, for example, Steve Feldman returns from his voyages. Hey guys, sorry, I had to take a piss. Then that would be the small print under, right? So, yeah, that was really well done, and the Molly bit at the very end was great. Yeah, it was just, but there was only one actor, Jim Norton, I guess is his name, and he does different voices, so he sounds like more than one guy, but he read all the male parts, and at the end.
Well, the Nighttown episode, or corresponding with Circe,
Right.
is written in the form of a play script, and so it'd be natural for doing all kinds of different voices, hundreds of characters.
He reads the stage directions to that too, and he'll say, for example, Leopold Bloom, as you see in a play, the name of the character about to speak, and then he'll read the stage directions. Turns to the right and smiles, and then he'll take the voice. So he does everything when he reads that. Listening to it like you would a play, you might miss some of that, I guess, because if it's not visual, then you don't know what the people are doing.
Yeah, stage directions are very lengthy and part of the whole effect. I've read that he wrote that first draft, and very near to the end of the whole project, he went back and decided to make sure that episode, because it's the last episode of before the Ithaca chapters when Ulysses returns home. He wants to encapsulate every encounter, every event, every character that's been mentioned in the whole novel up to this point. It is the lengthiest episode of the book, and it becomes just a hallucinogenic mind fuck. Really, it's it's crazy. He imagines himself pregnant, giving birth, and all sorts of deities are coming out of the sky, and he becomes God, basically. So I would love to see that. I'd love to hear that read out loud. Must be quite the experience.
There's a movie of it. I've never seen it, but it's like a 60-hour movie of the book, right?
So, really?
Yeah.
Amazing. Yes.
60 hours? Really?
No, I think it's a normal length.
No, I've read that there's like a 59 or something hour movie of this book.
There's a 1967 movie.
Which I saw when I was a college student before I had read Ulysses.
Yeah.
And thought it was kind of boring.
It was rated X when it came out. It got banned from some film festivals.
Wow.
I don't believe it was 60 hours, though. Unless there's another project you're referring to.
There's a 1954 film, which is, standard.
So there's more than one filmed version of the most unfilmable book ever.
Well, be careful. There's a 1954 movie called Ulysses, starring Kirk Douglas.
Oh, okay. So that's different.
Okay,
that's about
so
you.
That's just one
that's
of those.
the Odyssey, right?
MGM's version of it, or whatever you
right.
want to say. But speaking of that, one way to describe the Nighttown episode is it's a pure phantasmagoria.
Right.
Phantasmagoria is just a series of changing images that have almost no connection with each other. Dream kind of sequence. And were you saying that Joyce put it in dialogue form at the end?
No, the whole episode is a play script.
I know, but did he decide from the very beginning that he was going to identify the speaker of each one?
No, I think the format was the same. He just went and made it a lot more elaborate and folding in everything that had come before it, as far as I know.
Okay.
Filming a book like Ulysses is, of course, impossible unless it becomes a book or a movie about writing it itself, and you have James Joyce like in the movie, it would seem to me it sort of makes me think of that David Cronenberg version of Naked Lunch, right?
William
Like, oh my-
Burroughs.
yeah, they filmed Naked Lunch, but it's
But it was great.
it was pretty good.
Yeah.
But it's partly Naked Lunch. It's partly the story of William Burroughs writing Naked Lunch, and it adds some stuff from Burroughs' other works like Exterminator. And you know, I think approach like that would work with Ulysses because, you know, you mentioned that this work is very funny and ultimately it's very warm and humane and beautiful, but at the same time, you know, I maybe an analogy that I like to use is it's like the sun is shining on you when you're reading this, but often that sun will go behind the clouds, and that cloud is a magnificent cloud in the shape of James Joyce's head.
Mm-hmm.
And you sort of are inevitably, for me, stop considering these people's lives,
You get
Stephen
distracted.
and Leo and Molly, and you're just inside the enormous intellect of James Joyce, and it becomes about himself as an artist, and it sort of becomes, you're considering the monument of the book itself and not so much about the people.
So what
No,
you're
I
saying is
suspect-
that the way it's written obscures the story that it's telling.
I think it, for me, it did, and I'm sure, you know, upon rereading it, the structure, the scaffolding will fall away. I mean, no other book demands rereading more than Ulysses, of course. So you've reread it a number of times, and I'm sure, you know, that it
I
gets
like that
better.
scaffolding. It does get better. And for example, you mentioned the question and answer format at the end, the kitchen table in his house that he has to break into at the end because he lost his key or forgot his key. This is the omniscient narrator, I think, done to the nth degree. You know, there's a crime novel writer who I like very much, Elmore Leonard, and he was asked in an interview, you know, how do you write such catchy, great prose? And he said, you know, the parts that people skip, I leave those out. And James Joyce does the opposite. In that book, he puts them in and adds to them to the nth degree. He just adds and adds and adds, and he'll tell you how many cubic meters of water flow through the Dublin, you know, water waste disposal system or something.
Right,
And
I remember that.
I mean, he you know, you'll know the whole engineering framework of the city by the time you're done, and you know, yeah, it can seem tiresome, but I don't know. For me, I just got a clearer picture of it.
I don't necessarily mean that, you know, I'm forgetting about Leopold Bloom and his life and his worries and his concerns. That's not necessarily a bad thing, you know. The Oxen of the Sun episode, which is in the maternity ward, where the prose is split into 9 different styles representing the gestation or development of the entire English language, sort of as a metaphor for the gestation of the fetus in the womb. And the prose goes from, like, you know, Anglo-Saxon to Elizabethan English to various forms of, you know, 18th century, 19th century prose, sort of imitating or parodying some novelists. Some are sort of not very well known today. But it's certainly, when you're reading that, I'm not really thinking about, you know, Leopold Bloom going to the hospital to visit this woman who's having a very difficult delivery, and he's sort of shocked at the doctor's just getting drunk and making jokes about a birth control, for example. And I'm just sort of lost in the edifice of this monstrous ambition of what he's trying to do there, and it's amazing. And I'm in awe. But like I said, I've sort of lost sight of the humanity there. And again, on a rereading, it might come through a little more clearly. So again, it's like the sun going behind a beautiful cloud, and I'm thinking about the cloud. But as I said, Molly Bloom, the sun comes out and it's shining, and you're just bathed in warmth and radiance. So I think that's the nature of the novel. It's the modernist period where people were taking chances with form and structure. And it becomes more about James Joyce as an artist than about these people that he's imagined. And that's not, you can view it as a flaw, but it's just what this novel is.
Mm-hmm. I think it's meant to be reread so that, it's like you see a picture with a lot of dots in it and it looks like a forest, but really there's something else in the picture, and you keep staring at it until you see it, and finally you see it. And once you've seen it, then you can only see that, right? So it takes a while, I think, to, but eventually you'll see the humanity. And for me, something else about humanity is I find Leopold Bloom an unbelievably touching, his story, his father committing suicide, losing his infant son. And
Yes.
because he lost his infant son, he hasn't been able to have a complete sexual relation with his wife, whom he knows is cheating on him. In fact, imagines that she's banging a lot more guys than she's actually doing, but she is still, unfaithful. And it turns him on. There's something really, he's punishing himself. There's something really, there's a lot of pathos in the story, I thought. And
Yeah, well, if you're talking, Steve, you were talking about the sort of composition by accretion, that he was adding more and more and more. That is, in many ways, that's kind of an anti-modernist or maybe even post-modernist way of writing, because if you look at Hemingway or Eliot, both of them were preached taking away, reducing. Eliot had to give the manuscript of The Wasteland to Ezra Pound, okay, and Pound ripped about, I don't know, about 70 or 80% of the damn thing, I can't remember how much, and sent it back to Eliot. It was, a major poem produced by taking away, and Hemingway was preaching very much the same thing, at least through the 20s. Okay, and Sun Also Rises for sure, but maybe Joyce had already gone through that with the Dubliners, which is an extremely spare collection of short stories. Those stories are stripped down, to their very, very frames, beautifully so.
so is the Portrait of the Artist.
And Portrait of Artists
Yes.
too, yeah.
Yeah, I've read some criticism saying that, of course, this is a hallmark of modernism, but it really sort of looks to the future in a very postmodern way. The sort of catchphrases that I like to use, like modernism, modernists have lost faith in human civilization, but they still have faith in art. Whereas postmodernism not only has lost faith in civilization, but they've lost faith in art itself. So it's the art that sort of deconstructs or decenters itself. And this text sort of, certainly in terms of language, suggests that communication is difficult, if not impossible. Of course, the idea that, Ireland is, English is the language of the usurper, so the English taking over the native language, and so that's in there. And it sort of mocks itself as the idea that only art matters. And you can sort of see that postmodern attitude that, well, maybe art 2 is
He talks.
not really going to work.
I like his bit where he says the cracked looking glass of a servant being a symbol of Irish art.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, the woman who comes to deliver the milk, and
Exactly.
That's a famous line, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great
the
line.
cracked mirror of a servant.
A lot of those quotes that you hear, like "History is a nightmare," from which I'm trying to awake. That's
Stephen
basically
Douglas.
in the first chapter, right?
When
the
he
looking
meets
glass.
Mr. DC, he says that to the headmaster of his school
Yeah,
where he
the
teaches.
second
the
Yeah, right,
medalists,
right. Mhm.
And he's being lectured to by this ignorant, older man and pompous sort of.
You know, we've mentioned Dubliners and Portrait of the Artist. Just playing a thought experiment, like writing this book with the same characters and the same episodes, but stylistically, he's just going to write kind of conventional prose, like in Dubliners. Did you find yourself wishing for that at some point? Like the chapter that I hated, the Eumaeus episode, like, I kind of want the faintly falling snow from the dead, something a little more conventional. If he had done that, is it still Ulysses? Could it still be a classic, or would that be just 40% of what we have? It's kind of a ridiculous what if question, but
Well, Joyce kind of pastiches that idea in the Nausicaa episode again, that is written in the language of
Romance novels.
romantic fiction.
yes.
The sun, the sand, and everything else is described in these cliches. Okay, it's cliche upon cliche upon cliche. And that's exactly what the modernists were trying to escape. Cliches of 19th century prose, okay, even Dickens, but the lesser known writers that we've completely forgotten about.
Right, yeah.
Okay, I mean, there are a lot of writers that we don't know anything about, with whom Joyce was familiar and felt nothing but contempt.
It's
So
funny
in
you
some
should-
ways, we don't know what he's mocking.
It's funny you should
Exactly.
mention Hemingway in opposition to Joyce, because Hemingway, and that surprised the hell out of me, but he congratulated Joyce on his book, and he called it a most goddamn wonderful book. That was the
yeah.
quote. And, well, the book is, as far away from Hemingway as you can get, 1922. And then, was it, The Sun Also Rises was 26, like
Yeah.
4 years later. So, well, he didn't,
Well, I think, another person who absolutely admired, especially the Molly Bloom monologue, was T.S. Eliot. Okay, another person I just mentioned who seemed to be operating in a
minimalist kind of way.
in a different aesthetic. Right. Okay, but I think they were excited that something new and unsettling was appearing, and it was. Besides that, it was really good. Okay, the way we feel sometimes about a new book that comes out that not only shocks us in terms of style but in content, but also is a great read.
Yeah, Eliot, I believe, thought that this book, this is really what I was trying to do with The Wasteland, like taking old myths and show how they inform the present, even while acknowledging that those myths have crumbled and are kind of useless now, but it's still part of, what makes us up. You had a good quote from Hemingway talking about Ulysses. I've got a few quotes that I dug up from the internet. Virginia Woolf called Ulysses the work of a queasy undergraduate scratching his pimples. I like that quote.
Envy there, maybe?
It's interesting because when you talk about modernist writers who use stream of consciousness technique, I think Joyce and Woolf are the two.
They're applying the same trade in many
Right,
ways.
yeah.
Both the innovators at the same time.
Yeah. And so, well, she
Professional jealousy.
perhaps. Karl Radek, a Soviet critic, called Ulysses a dung heap swarming with worms photographed by a movie camera through a microscope.
Too much vodka.
The Dublin Review called, I was talking about Joyce here. A great Jesuit trained intellect has gone over malignantly and mockingly to the powers of evil. And this is my favorite line. American critic Arnold Bennett said, anyone could have written the dailiest day possible, given sufficient time, paper, childish caprice, and obstinacy. When you finish the novel, you have the sensation of a general who has just put down an insurrection.
That's really good. Okay. And I can sympathize with that response to Ulysses in some ways. Okay. It's
Yeah. Frank, when we were emailing earlier, like last month, and you kind of gave me a little attitude like, okay, so you finished Ulysses. Like, what do you want, a cookie? Like, it shouldn't be this thing like, I finished Ulysses, now I'm in this secret club and join the ranks of the fortunate. And
you become a
Well,
snob.
I think there's a mystique, snobbishness around it
Yeah.
that is kind of itself forbidding. I think a lot of people give up because they think it's harder than it really is. It's, you know, you have to be, you know, the badger and the grizzly, you know, the grizzly doesn't need to fight because every other creature runs away from the grizzly. But when the grizzly runs into a badger, the badger doesn't move, it refuses to move, and in the end, the grizzly walks away. So you have to be the badger with this book. You'll get through it, but don't be intimidated, and just think of it as, you know, if you look for comedy and if you look for sex, which a lot of people, I certainly do, you know, and of course the human aspects of, I find Stephen a little bit off-putting personally as a character. I think Leopold Bloom is maybe the best character I've ever read in all of fiction. He's just so lovable. I mean, he's such he's so flawed, but he's just a good guy, you know. He's so knowledgeable. Of course, about 80% of what he knows is so, and the other 20% he knows things that aren't, you know, that are not true. But he takes interest in everything. He loves, you know, the heavens, and he knows all the constellations, and he can talk about anything.
he's a bit of a mansplainer, isn't he?
I suppose, but anyway, I thought.
I mean, the very first
he's also,
glimpse.
he's also, I remember the word now, he's also a lookist.
Oh,
A
lookist.
A lookist. Someone who stares at women.
Oh, is that? I
Okay,
didn't know that.
that's a term that,
Oh, that's
lookism?
the modern term.
Oh, is it?
That's the PC.
Lookism, right.
Lookism.
PC description of the male gaze. Okay, that's talked about
Well,
so much these days.
You know, speaking of him just being a wonderful, decent guy, the first glimpse we have of him is he's cooking breakfast for his wife in bed.
Ate with relish. What was the first sentence? Mr. Leopold Bloom ate with relish the inner organs of beasts and fowls, or something like that.
He liked the urine-y tang
Yeah.
of the pork
The
kidneys.
kidneys.
Yeah, not very kosher there,
Nope.
Leopold.
If
But
you're-
he's not. Technically, he's not a Jew. His father was a Jew,
Right.
and he feels guilty for the suicide of his father because his father, who's a Hungarian Jew, said, you know, you've betrayed the faith of your fathers. And Leopold has converted twice, once to some Protestant, you know, denomination, and then to Catholicism. So he's betrayed the faith of his fathers twice, and his father killed himself after reproaching him for it.
Yeah, like everything else, Leopold Bloom's Jewishness gets complicated.
But he's not actually Jewish.
Yeah, right.
That's the
He
and
did not-
then when he runs into the citizen, I loved that bit. The citizen throws, what does he throw at him? Some heavy piece of metal or some.
Right, yeah.
Anyway, I'll brain you, you know. But the citizen representing like pure Ireland or something, you know, anti-Semitism, and then Blood goads him, your savior was a Jew. And it's a wonderful part, I thought, of the book.
Yeah, it's interesting that Bloom is reminded very subtly again and again, number one, that he's Jewish, and number two, that his wife is sleeping with Blazes Boylan. Okay, he's reminded that very subtly throughout the book. It's kind of a motif that, in a sense, holds the book together, creates Bloom himself.
If I find anything unlikable about him, is he's a little too obsequious or a little too self-effacing. Excuse me, pardon me, and he's too polite by half. He doesn't stand up for himself very much.
Yeah, you want him to be more, well, if you're supposed to be Odysseus, why don't you be a little more Odysseus-y?
Right.
That's the funny thing about the opening scene of the first Bloom section, where he's eating the innards of animals and stuff like that. It's a really great description of the Odyssey, I think. If you ever read Homer's Odyssey, okay, nobody ever in that whole book eats a vegetable, but they are constantly eating meat and bread all the time.
I remember in the Cyclops cave there's cheese too.
Okay.
Right? Yeah.
But one thing I remember as I read it, okay, after I finished reading the Odyssey, I thought back about it, and,
Well, what about the lotus eaters? Eating lotus, doesn't that count? It's more taking drugs than eating a vegetable, I suppose.
Yeah, they weren't eating it for nutrition. They were eating it for the psychedelic experience, I suppose.
Going back to, speaking of eating, I agree with you wholeheartedly, Frank, that you should not read this as a chore, like eating your broccoli because it's good for you, but it's not very pleasant. It's not like something that you hate doing, but you're glad when you're done, like running a marathon or climbing Mount Everest. But at the same time, it is a challenge. And like anything that's challenging, you get to the end, you feel like, oh, I'm glad I did that. But at its heart, you should read any novel because of the feelings it engenders, it stirs, warmth, the humanity, the humaneness of Joyce's vision. That's what draws us to it. That's what makes people reread it, as you have several times.
And like the same as when you climb Everest, you need a Sherpa to help you. And so if you're lost in some part of the book where, what am I reading? I mean, you can Google it and you'll find chapter and verse on everything that means and what Joyce is actually doing, and that probably should pique your interest. I didn't see that. Wow, that's amazing. He's doing that, And yeah, I think that.
Yeah, there are several works out there. There's the Bloomsday Companion. There's online. There's the Joyce Project, which has all the text of the novel with links, explanations throughout. So there's tons of resources out there. For myself, over the past few months, I admit I did a quick, literal summaries from SparkNotes. And then after finishing an episode, I'd read some commentary from a number of different sources. A few I read before reading the literal summary. Some I read the literal summary before. I kind of experimented with different approaches. There's no one way to do it. If you manage to find a great professor who can lead you through it, I would love to take a class on it now after having read it once. It's a giant forest and there's more than one path through it.
Yeah, I think you have to read it for the sheer joy of the prose. In fact, one way to think about it is that this is just a humongous prose poem rather than a novel. The last time I read Moby Dick, I decided I'm not going to read this as a novel because I know what happens. Okay, I know the story, I've read it before, and I decided I'm going to read it as just a sequence of prose poems. chapter by chapter. Just enjoy that. Okay. And I really liked it a lot more than I had ever liked it before. Not forcing myself to have to see the big picture. But the parts that I've enjoyed the most reading in Ulysses have been the parts where I just sat down and said, I'm gonna read this and enjoy it, get a kick out of it for a while. Again, the Molly Bloom monologue is, excellent for that sort of thing.
We're sitting here in Busan, South Korea. Of course, a work as renowned as Ulysses has been translated into several languages. It's been translated into Korean. Could you imagine? How do you do that? Of course, Shakespeare has been translated into numerous languages, and you think of how much is lost. You must lose so much reading Ulysses in another language, especially non-Western language like Korean. It just boggles the mind how you would translate this.
Well, just to go back to the episode in the hospital, how do you do nine? Are there nine stages of Korean? That you go from the Chinese, you start with the Chinese, and then you progressively go to the modern Korean?
Impossible. Cannot be done.
Right.
A student of mine brilliant student, went on, she's currently getting a PhD in astrophysics at Stanford. I love Joyce, and actually went to some meetings of the Joyce Society up in Seoul. This young Korean teenage girl and a bunch of starchy old ajashi professors. She said she wants to be the first Korean to translate, or first person to translate Finnegan's Wake into Korean. Wow. And I said, well, you're going to have to translate it into English first.
English first, right? And then
You'll have to be the first Korean to read it before you translate it, probably. I don't know how many people.
Yeah, so maybe that is a good point to sort of wrap up the show here. Looking forward to a book that is Ulysses on steroids in terms of difficulty and density and strangeness, seemingly not even written in English. I've read parts, I've listened to parts, there's famous parts of Joyce reading it, which is quite amazing. Perhaps the topic of a further podcast, we'll see. I'd like to thank you guys very much. This was a blast. It's inspired me to, I'm going to go back and reread the whole thing right now.
Well,
Tonight,
once
tomorrow. Yeah. We're recording this on May 15th. We're about a month before Bloomsday.
Yeah.
Hopefully we can get this packaged, wrapped up, edited, and released before then. That would be fortuitous timing. It's a day that there are Joycean celebrations all over, certainly
Dublin for sure.
Dublin, but also in America.
I'm sure all over New York City, I'm sure.
The actual manuscript is in the Rosenbach Rare Book Museum in Philadelphia. And you can actually go and see a few pages of the handwritten manuscript, I believe from the first chapter. I remember Snot Green Sea, seeing that written down in Joyce's own handwriting, which is pretty cool.
Scrotum tightening sea.
The scrotum tightening scene,
Yeah.
yes.
Perfect.
I always think of that when I jump into cold water.
Yeah.
So thank you, Frank Beaucher. Thank you, Bob Perchan. This has been Tales of Braving Ulysses on the Liquid Arts Podcast Network. Thank you all for listening.
Okay, thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.